Hi, everyone. Okay, so the work I'm going to present, I'm going to try to show you how you can build, how you can grow artificial neural networks with self-organizing methods. First, the inspiration for the project. We took inspiration by how biological organisms grow the nerve system. Unlike typical reinforcement learning agents, where you start with your policy and you just find the weights of this neural network, the nerve system for organisms self-organize through a developmental process. So cells interact with each other in a local rule until you obtain a global pattern. Another interesting thing about biological organisms is that all the cells share the same program, right? If you think of the genome, you can think of that as the cell behavior as running this code that it has inside, right? And it's shared across all of them. So we usually formalize this with the notion of indirect encoding. That's simply a mapping from the genotype to the phenotype. In our case, we're interested in a specific type of indirect encoding, which is called developmental indirect encoding. And this is simply adding time to a developmental, indirect encoding. So you cannot go from your genotype to your phenotype in a single time step. Instead, you need to run this through a series of time steps to unfold information that you have on the genotype. And there's an interesting analogy to cellular automata, which is the notion of computational irreducibility. That is, you cannot, this is shown for some cellular automata rules, you cannot obtain an analytical expression that tells you the state of the system after n steps. The only way you can know that state is to actually run the computation. So this is conjecture as an analogy in developmental biology. Not necessarily that is ontologically true, but is de facto conjecture to be going on. Why are we interested in indirect encodings? One reason is compression. So roughly you have 1 gigabyte of information capacity in human DNA. And if you do a back of the envelope calculation of how much space it would take to encode the connectivity matrix of your 100 billion neurons, that would take roughly 700 terabytes. So that means that you cannot find the connectivity matrix of your brain directly encoded in your genome. So there has to be some process that the information we know is there. So there has to be some process that unfold that information over time. The other reason we're interested in indirect encodings is the notion of genomic bottleneck hypothesis in the context of AI. And this says that it is precisely because the genome has a finite amount of space in which it has to encode information, so neural circuits, it has an incentive to find solutions that can generalize, right? So it has an incentive to develop a circuit that can be used in different situations. This is a conjecture, by the way. So if we want to frame this in AI terms, the goal of the project is to build a generative model for neural connectivities. If you think of a brain is not a human brain. It's not a specific connectivity. Like two people here, we can have human brain and we can have very different synaptic connectivity. Well, actually, we can frame what we mean by a brain as a distribution, right? And then we can see every person, every specific synaptic connectivity as sampling from this distribution. And we specifically, in this the model that we're presenting, we sample this through a developmental process. All right, so the work that I'm presenting now is building on a paper that we presented last year. This is called HyperNCA. I was going to introduce the notion of cellular automata, but I think it's been hard to avoid knowing about cellular automata in the conference so far. So I would only say that it is a computational model that you apply to every cell or every node of your space, and you update the state of every cell based only on your neighbors. So each cell will look at the surrounding and they say, what's your state? What's my state? And then I get a new state. So you use them by having a seed. So you have a seed in your, say you have a grid, a two-dimensional grid. You have a single point in the center. You apply this rule. This rule can be a if-else rule, or it can be a cellular neural network rule, a polynomial, doesn't matter. And then it will grow a pattern out of this seed. So this is what we did with the HyperNCA. we took, imagine a 2D an image, we grow a pattern, and then we interpret the values of this pattern, so the pixels, as weights in a neural network. So if you have a 2D, if you have a matrix, that's basically the connectivity matrix between two layers in a neural network, right? And if you do that on a 3-dimensional, well, then you have a feed-forward network, right? So we show that you can grow these patterns that can be, when interpreted as policy networks, you can use them to solve reinforcement learning tasks. And you get compression, by the way. You can have like your NCA can be very small in relation to the amount of weights that you have in the final policy. The problem with this approach is that I have a few shortcomings. Among them, that you need to define the size of the substrate that you're operating with. And that means that you start with the size of the neural network and you cannot change it. You can only produce feed-forward. More critically, that the notion of neighborhood in the grid space does not translate naturally to the policy space. So to address these shortcomings, we came up with this thing that we're calling neural developmental programs. It is essentially very similar to the HyperNCA. The main difference is that we're moving from a grid substrate to a network substrate, which in retrospect is a very obvious choice for growing networks, right? So I'm going to walk you through how we build this. We start with a seed in the same way that with an NCA, you need to have a starting seed, so the initial condition of your dynamical system. In the paper, we usually use a single cell to start with, and I'm going to show you a video afterwards. But for illustration purposes here, we start with a network with 3 nodes. So every cell will have an state, and this is encoded as a n-dimensional vector. Then you do information aggregation. So you let every cell, every node, share the information with the neighbors. This is called message passing. But we do this with a neural network. So we pass the message, and then this message is passed through a feed-forward network. So this is what we call in machine learning a graph convolution. So now every cell has updated the information to the neighbors, right? In some type of information that we don't know what it means and we don't care really about. Now we have another network that look at the state of every cell and say, okay, based on this state, which of the nodes is in growing mode? And those that this network classify as growing nodes will add new nodes to them. And we connect these nodes not only to them, but to the immediate neighbors. So if you're trying to grow a network that is unweighted, this is where we stop. Now you have grown your network. But if you want your final network to be weighted, so the edge to have a weight between them, now we have another network that predicts the weights between the nodes. Basically, you take the state of every 2 pair of nodes, concatenate it, and then predicts the weight. All right, so if we put everything together, we have seeding, or the current state of the network, information aggregation, this cells share the states with the neighbors, graph grow, and synaptic strength prediction. So you run this as this is a single developmental cycle, right? So you run this many times until you get the final network that you want. So it is this collection of 3 neural networks that we call the developmental program. So the graph convolution, the grow network, and the weight prediction. And this is going to be the 3 networks that we're going to train. So this is the degrees of freedom of our model that we're going to train, such that the final network that we grow solve a task or has some properties, as I'm going to show after. So this is the training loop. You evolve the developmental program, you let it grow for a number of steps, you evaluate on a given task, and based on the performance, you update the weights of the developmental program. We have 2 flavors. We have evolution one. So we use CMAS for this. And we also have a differential flavor that has a bit more constraints, but it's essentially the same. And for that one, we use PPO. Okay, so I'm going to show what it looks like when you grow the network. This is going to be the seed. If you think in terms of the cellular automata, is the initial node that we have. And the blurry numbers that you see on top of it, that's the initial state of the cell. This is a sample Fermat distribution. Then you apply the developmental program for a number of steps. In this case, we have 4 growing cycle. And you end up with a network of 16 nodes, fairly small. Now we take this network and we're going to use it to solve a reinforcement learning task. So this is the Luna Lander. Here you basically can think you have 4 buttons and you need to decide whether you do thrust to the left, to the right, up, or you do nothing. So the network, the red nodes that you see, this is how the network takes the information. And the blue nodes, those are the output space, right? So this is the ones that based on you sample from there, which one has the maximum activation, and that's the action that you take, right? So where you're seeing the green, the yellow node, that's the one that has the maximum activation at a given time. So that's the one deciding whether to push the lander to the right, to the left, or up. Same way with, this is with the differential version. In this case, we initialize not with a single node, but with a minimum connection network, so something that just connects the input space to the output space. Likewise, it grows for a number of steps. And when we evaluate it on the lander, it does the same thing, right? It maps the observation. In this case, is the position of the lander, velocity, angular velocity, and so on, onto the action to take, so it lands safely. If you're not familiar with this environment, it randomizes the landscape of the landing, so it's a bit challenging. We test in a set of domains, so reinforcement learning task, locomotion, sort gates, and MNIST, so the digit classification. Training curves, what you would expect, the carpal, which is a very simple environment to solve in a few generations. The Luna Lander, a bit more tricky, you need a few thousand generations, and the sort gate, just a few hundred generations. So one interesting thing that you can do with this is not to use it to grow, outside of the context of artificial intelligence, but to grow, for example, topologies, right? Because you can basically codify whichever targets you want in your objective function. So you can say, for example, I want to grow a network that has small wall property. This type of network that most nodes are not neighboring with each other, but you can hop between every 2 nodes in a few steps, right? So use this as a reward. And then we show that you can grow these networks that satisfy this condition. So potentially has also interesting application in network theory, because there's not that many algorithms to grow small world connectivities, right? So if this is doing it somehow, is it doing it in the determinate way? Is it doing it in a different way? All right, so just to wrap up, the takeaway for me is of this type of project, I think is the potential of algorithmic growth. I think it's much more interesting, and I think there's a lot of more potential, although currently it's not doing a state of the art, and it's not the goal, to encode the process that to encode the outcome. So rather than encoding the configuration of the brain, to encode the process that gives rise to that configuration. And this is future work that we will do. I said that one of the reasons that we're interested in indirect encodings is because of compression. But actually, currently, our developmental programs have more parameters than the networks that we grow. And this is because the tasks that we're trying to solve here are very simple. So it managed to find solutions that don't require very big networks. But the goal would be, could you use this approach to grow, say, something with like a transformer? Could you, in the same way that cellular automata with a very simple rule can produce a very complex pattern, can you apply the same principle and grow these massive transformer models with billion parameters with a very few parameters? So it's the interesting property of the model, right? That the number of parameters of your developmental program is constant with respect to the number of the parameters of the networks that you're growing. It's a model that potentially could be used to test the genomic bottleneck hypothesis. It's a developmental model that we can use in AI to test this. And one thing that I'm very interested in is combining topological properties with performance. So if I solve a given reinforcement learning task, locomotion or something more complex, right? And at the same time, I encourage the network to have a small wall connectivity. Do I get better performance? Do I get worse performance? If I want the network to be balanced, for example, if you're familiar with the spiking networks, what if my network balance? Well, you can do this by simply plugging on the objective function. This is all from me. I want to leave it with a quote from Murakami, since we're in Japan, that I interpret as the Murakami's take on computational irreducibility. Thank you so much.